Well, thank you for your participation today. After me, I want to introduce you to Mr. Chris Watson. Chris has been with Premise now for 2 years. He spent a considerable time in his career in international development, and I am truly honored to have him as our next speaker and as a very good friend of mine. Chris. You don't need this.
Oh, yeah, I think I do. No, they changed it. How we doing here? Everyone hear me? Thanks. My slides were terrible anyway, don't worry about it. Look, like Maury said, my name's Chris Watson. I really appreciate you all coming here today. Since I was in kindergarten, there's always been at least 3 Chris's in every one of my classes, so I've usually just been called Watson since I've been working, but now that I'm in some litigation with the IBM folks, you're probably just gonna have to call me Chris. So. Look, so here's what I want to do today. I'm going to tell 2 stories that have had a really big impact on my career and my life, and in between that, I'm going to sandwich this big hunk of how I think digital transformation and the data revolution can radically increase the impact that we can have vis-a-vis the sustainable development goals and the journey to self-reliance. So, story 1. These days, and Maury kind of took a little bit about this from me, but when you hear phrases like Silicon Valley or big tech, the narrative's starting to kind of sour a little bit, right? We've got all these things that we didn't have before and these experiences that are much more catered to us, but we're also hearing about monopolistic practices or fake news or issues of data privacy and maybe job loss due to automation. I also sometimes get the sense that, like, while I can get something delivered to my door now, since I live in DC, the next day from Amazon, that, like, maybe technology haven't given us everything that we hoped that it would create in terms of, like, societal progress. Peter Thiel, who's the founder of PayPal, has got this quote that I always loved, which was like, "We wanted flying cars, and instead we got 140 characters." But I actually don't think this prevailing narrative is correct. I think that it masks a trend that's been happening for a while now, but has really had an uptick in the last 5 to 10 years that's important. And that's this certain type of company that's receiving a lot of investment on the West Coast, and actually in a lot of India too, that we call a B2B company. So a business that provides services to other businesses or to the government. B2B investment's up 28% this year, which is 30% up last year, and basically on and on. And so, when I started to get involved in tech, because I came from development, I really started to ask myself this question, like, what are all these companies that I'd never heard of selling? And if you looked at the agenda, it's no surprise, it's digital transformation. So, what's digital transformation? I think, when you look into the research, most people are going to talk about 2 different groups of things. The first is just taking stuff that used to be on paper or really rote manual processes and making them digital. And that's been going on for a really long time. Snail mail was really low-hanging fruit when we moved to email. Now that we've got DocuSign, if you're working at USAID, you don't have to take a memo around to 6 different people's desks to get clearance anymore, maybe. If you've got Expensify, you won't need to create these Excel expense reports every time you go somewhere. It's completely changed my life. They're not paying me to say that. And then also, it's led to some companies that frankly maybe haven't been the biggest story, but a company like Zoom that does video conferencing software was the most profitable company to go public this year. So that's the easy stuff. To be honest, I don't actually think it's the most interesting thing that's happening. I'm really interested in the second group, which is this move from manual business processes to ones that are more automated. So this should work now? There we go. Those are the companies you never heard of. Now I've caught up. So when you start to look at these companies that are helping, mainstream digital transformation and the use of data and technology in these large legacy businesses, you will see a lot of people that you've never heard of. Some of them are involved in industries with really big markets like construction or healthcare. But what you're going to find is that at the core, the main business process that they are working on is decision making. And I think that is actually the most important process going on in international development today as well. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So if you think about marketing, right, like this is the old world. It's a bunch of white guys in a room with some whiteboards or pictures of hamburgers that are trying to cook up ad campaigns. I don't think that's going to go completely away. I mean, we're still going to have Super Bowl ads. TV still exists. But in reality, the day-to-day job of a marketer looks incredibly different now. This is how you run ads on Facebook. And what you'll see about this is that this is built for an analyst as much as it is a creative. You've got a couple key performance indicators on here, the cost that to you to reach 1,000 people and the cost for you to reach 1,000 people who actually then interacted with your ad. And what it allows you to do is run different types of ads, like I've got here, compare their performance against different versions, and sort of optimize the way that you're doing marketing. So in an effort to understand, I think, what a digitally transformed development industry might look like, it makes sense to talk about some of the characteristics that we see now. So the first thing that I look at is that when we have a question or an inquiry that we need answered so that we can make a decision, there's a really long time delay. So you've got to come up with these inquiries, you've got to tender an assessment that's going to go out to a consulting firm who's going to go and try to answer them. Data is going to be collected using anything from like a literature review to actually sending teams to the field, and then you're going to get a report. So the first is there's a time delay on our ability to get data. The second is that sort of because of that, and to some extent the costs as well, our ability to collect data tends to be pretty episodic. So like I think everyone's here is probably familiar with this idea of having a baseline, a midterm, and an inline. So maybe now we're getting data every 2.5 years. That's probably the worst case. I think in a lot of global health, it can be a little better than that. We've got the National Demographic Health Survey that's run annually. We've got, sort of complete-ish health management and information systems that can be rolled up maybe monthly. But like even when we look at sort of the simplest data that we collect, which is just the outputs of our project, often that's only really being compiled and analyzed on a quarterly basis. So data tends to be collected episodically. The third thing is the effort of posing and answering these questions is actually like really technical work, right? You've got to have somebody like a principal investigator or a data analyst who's able to take everything that you've got and put it together and try to make sense of it. And so I think when you combine all of these things together, the end result is this sort of like static and often incomplete picture of the world or the context or the system that we're trying to affect with our development programs. And so why is that? I tend to think that a lot of it comes from the tools that we have at our disposal, so sort of like the opposite of form follows function. If we start with data collection, sort of the initial piece, we often tend to refer to a lot of primary data collection as field work, and like as the name implies, we've got to send people to the field, whether that be from the States or from a local NGO or some university or an enumeration firm. They're going to do surveys, they're going to do focus groups, they might do key informant interviews, and then maybe we're going to try to supplement that with some third-party data that probably was not actually collected to be used for our problem in the first place. Next, we have a data integration challenge. And so now that I've spent the last couple of years working with data scientists, I hear this common gripe, which is like I spend 90% of my time cleaning data and then only 10% of my time actually doing science. And I think I see my colleague Tim in the room, and I see a couple of hands as well. So I don't think I'm making this up. And so the process of turning this data that we've collected, especially if it comes from multiple sources, into something that's actually fit for analysis requires a lot of subject matter expertise and is really time intensive. So, our tools here are people like Tim and statistical analysis software. After that, we've got this sense-making function, which is like, okay, we've got the data together, we've got it like cleaned, we now in a position to really start to take some of the analysis and turn it into an insight or a recommendation that we can use to take a decision. This is, again, relying on the same sorts of people and tools that I just mentioned before and is contributing dramatically to this time delay. And so the end result is that when we think about how we execute programs, often what happens is we're forced to sort of plan everything for a year or for 3 years or 5 years, depending on the length of your project, and adapt on this really long iteration cycle and try to execute against Gantt charts that no one can actually read once they've submitted it in their proposal. So what would a new world look like? I think it makes sense to look at how digital transformation in other industries has changed things as a guide to think about what some of the characteristics are that we can reasonably expect to see. So the first, I think that our delayed data is starting to become immediate. And I hesitate to say real time because I think there's some arguments about what is actually real time. But think about it this way. Data that we're able to receive in time to take a decision at a meaningful point in time. And that means more self-service ability to then go and collect this data. I also think it means that the insights into the needs of our beneficiaries and into the performance of our program is going to be generated continuously instead of episodic. So now we're going to start to be able to adapt our activities as we can see the context changing, either in the form of a dashboard or in some other sort of way of surfacing the data in a way that it makes sense to all of us. And what that means is that in this new world, we're all going to look more like a technologist or a data scientist, even if we maybe don't know Python or don't have a master's in some sort of policy work that required substantial statistics. I don't, and I can use our stuff. So it's going to allow us to surface an insight and a recommendation for a decision directly into the hands of the managers on the ground and the policymakers and the strategy folks without that time delay. And so I think to create this new world, we have to think a lot about what are some of the tools that are going to allow us to do data collection like this. So frankly, and I say data collection accidentally instead of analysis because I really think that data is maybe the hardest piece of this puzzle. If you think back to this like Facebook example that I gave, you know that Facebook is able to continuously populate the performance of those ads because they control what your Facebook feed looks like, they control what your profile looks like, they control how much of that data actually feeds into their algorithms. They're good at keeping you, engaged, i.e. maybe addicted, so that you're continuously generating that data. And I don't really see a world where we're going to have everyone living in poverty interacting with us through a software platform continuously. But there are some proxy ways to get around that, right? For those of you who know Premise's work, we're really focused on getting ordinary citizens involved in data collection, so in the form of gig work, so we're paying them. But that way we can make it cheaper because people are working in their own communities, but also more frequent and continuous. I also think that there's a lot that can be done with remote sensing technology. So these are drones and satellites, but our ability to continuously monitor how the physical world is changing. When it comes to some of the more tactical stuff, I think things like RFID chips or our ability to stick sensors on lots of things so that they can generate a data stream is also really helping improve this. And hell, I mean, that's even what barcodes were for originally, right? So we're definitely getting there. The second is, now that we've got better control over the data and we can control the structure specifically of it, then the integration problem becomes a lot easier, or in many cases becomes possible at all. I know that this is something like some of the folks in IBM are really focused on, is making it so we can use all of this as basically one giant data source as opposed to a bunch of pieces in a bunch of different places. And so now, and you can see how this sort of cascades on itself, right? So like now that we've got data coming in more continuously and in high volumes and frequency, and we control the structure of it, our ability to start to make inferences from the data and gather insights in a way that's automatic increases. And that's what's really bringing online these applications that you might hear in prescriptive or predictive analytics. And so when all of that's up, we start to see a new programming paradigm that I think in Silicon Valley this is often referred to as agile, but here we probably refer to it as adaptive management. But the whole idea is that we're going to start to be able to value less our ability to comply with a year or 2 years of predefined activities, and more about our ability to respond to a context as it's changing, and our ability to analyze how we are playing a part in changing that context, especially around measuring those specific interactions. And I think some of that, especially for the folks over here that are within the U.S. government, you might think that bureaucracy is going to get in the way of that. But I've been really impressed with some of the co-creation work that USAID has done, and some of the human-centered design work that the Gates Foundation has been doing, that is both designing approaches that will actually allow us to adapt and move this way, but within the existing contracting, mechanisms and paradigms that we have now. So let me try to give you an example. That was pretty theoretical, right? So let me try and put all of this together. So in Colombia, and I know we've got some health people in the room, so hopefully this resonates, there's a number of cities that are endemic for both Zika and dengue. It's the same mosquito. And so in an urban area, the way the government of Colombia has sought to address this is to set up a set of teams who consistently monitor the sewer system openings, because there's always going to be water there, and thus there's a higher chance that mosquitoes are going to breed there relative to somewhere else. Actually, I think it's like 28 times higher. And so if you look at how they've gone about doing that, send a team through the city every 6 to 7 weeks, depending. And what you get is sort of like these pen and paper records of how many of the sewers tested positive and how much larvicide you applied that unfortunately is never digitized. It just sits in a room in their office. It's used basically to prove that the person went to work that day and attached to their timesheet. And then, because that data is not being integrated or analyzed, what it means is that they have a static approach to vector surveillance and control that does not actually change based on any data. And so, luckily USAID recognized this problem and piloted a bunch of initiatives to try and address it, most of which are pretty data-driven, and one of which was with Premise. So the way that we first went about the problem is we need to actually get the data from the health inspectors in real time first. So put them on an app. I think the idea of doing mobile data collection isn't too new for anyone. But the other thing we realized is that the sewer system is an incomplete denominator of all the potential mosquito breeding sites, right? There's plenty of things in people's homes, in public spaces, vacant lots. And so we chose to create another data source of ordinary citizens who were doing that data collection and combine it all up into the same model. And so it turns out, when you look at that data, and again, it doesn't always have to be completely immediate. If you just look at the past 30 days data, you will find that consistently 15% of the neighborhoods in a given city are driving about 85% of the risk. So there's sort of a power law there. And what the government of Colombia has been able to do is then say, I'm going to reallocate where my workers are going to the areas that are highest risk at any given time. And there's this threshold, it's 5%, and it's just number of places that test positive over the denominator. It doesn't have to be complicated math. And so just by changing where the workers are going, so it's not a static route every 6 to 7 weeks, what they're able to find is that they can use the same workforce, less larvicide, less of the fumigation chemicals, and keep the risk below that 5% threshold all the time. All right, story 2. So back in 2009, the Obama administration announced a troop surge in Afghanistan, and that brought with it a really dramatic expansion of the US government and a number of our NATO allies' development assistance to the region, especially in the south and the east. And I know there's a couple other people here who were part of that. This was a context where, because you had areas that were being liberated by the Taliban, because you had people moving back from Kabul to their farms, you had people coming back from Pakistan, is literally the perfect definition of a dynamic environment that is changing all the time. It was unfortunately also the definition of a data-poor environment. We had very little data on what was actually going on, and what it meant is that our sense-making functions were not up to the task at all. This whole scenario had a different problem, which is after you've been in Afghanistan for 8 years, it's pretty hard to get people who want to go and live in the middle of a war zone, which is how I ended up there at 22 with a ridiculously large budget. The only tools I really had at my disposal were an Excel sheet to track how much of my seed and fertilizer had been delivered and which of it had been distributed. And then 118 Afghans who put their lives at risk all the time trying to make this project a success. And this is an experience that frankly haunts me to this day, and it's a big part of why I'm at Premise. It's not because I was in a war zone. It's because I don't really know if what I was doing helped. I didn't have a window into the impact that our program was having or not having. I didn't have a dashboard or a speedometer to tell me what I might be able to tweak or do differently in order to increase that impact. And so I want to end with a call to action for all of us. The more I've got to understand digital transformation in the private sector, I realize that these companies can answer questions that are really sophisticated. What's the foregone profit if my supply chain is functioning suboptimally? They can then use that data to improve that performance, triage what the problems are, and fix it. And so I'd like you to ask yourselves, what's the foregone impact of a development program that's performing suboptimally? Because I think our beneficiaries deserve to have these types of capabilities brought to bear. Thanks. I think we've got some time left, and we can take some questions, and I believe there's some people that can run mics out of the room. I'm going to step slightly out of that light. There we go.
Hi, thanks. My name's Travis Mayo. I'm from USAID's Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning. And I think this is a broad question, and I think it gets to the opening remarks as well. of the private sector is able to innovate and use data because it's a battle for survival. If they don't, they're going to die. And within the government, within the public sector, there's not that same impetus, that need. And we also have different risk tolerances, right? And so I guess one question is, where does the drive, what have you seen? What have you learned from your work with other parts of the public sector where data is being used, where there are those bright spots? Where has that drive come from? And how has the willingness and the risk to innovate, where did that motivation come from, and how was it implemented in a way that it was successful? I think because that's one of the biggest barriers, right, to being able to use this effectively. I'll just stop there for now.
No, it's the perfect question, and it's one that I've thought about a lot. And it turns out there's actually another industry that has this same problem, and it's healthcare. And the problem with healthcare is there's some folks in Andreessen Horowitz, they refer to it as the can't get paid problem. And it's because it's not just a relationship between a provider and a patient. It's between a provider, a patient, and an insurance company. And the problem is you have got to get insurance companies to be able to get a win for covering new super effective treatments that also might be really expensive. Like the whole gene therapy, drugs that are becoming available is maybe 2 now, like $1 million a treatment, right? So how do you go and introduce that? And so I think that the one thing that the healthcare industry has on its side that we also do too is that a lot of us didn't get into this to drive in, the bottom line, right? There's a willingness on, and I'm going to be honest, right? We sent invites out for people who were attending this, and we picked people that we thought cared more than just, punching a clock. And I think that the real key is to be able to take the risk to become sort of an entrepreneur within our own agencies, or start your own company working in development, right? Because what I found is that if you are actually passionate enough about this problem, your authenticity speaks louder than, frankly, even the data maybe. And I know that's not a great answer, but I always challenge myself to find the people who are speaking the same language, who are thinking the same way. Not to toot your horn, Travis, but that's why I invited you. But we're up against a sort of mix of incentives that I think is causing some problems here for sure. There's also this concept called the innovator's dilemma, where the whole idea is once you've got a legacy program or company involved in an industry, they tend to only create incremental innovations because anything that's truly disruptive will end up cannibalizing their existing business. I think that's kind of a problem too, but it's probably why you see not enough really large implementing partners applying for things like these broad agency announcements at USAID that are really time intensive and involve co-creation. But I think getting non-traditional partners involved who have something to gain from that as well is probably another avenue, but it's maybe one of the key challenges facing us today.
Good morning.
I think you're on.
Yeah, I'm Rand Robinson with Food for Peace, USAID. I've had a question for a number of years, and you're going to be able to answer it because I've never found anyone who might know. But as a novice to this world, I know development, but not what we're talking about so very well. But often for some years, I've marveled at the prospect of we commonly get feedback from our partners through quarterly reports and so on. You know it very well. But what's going to happen now, if it's not happening already, is there's no reason that beneficiaries can't be feedbacking straight to donors. And what's going to really happen then? We are on the edge of not just a revolution, but also an avalanche of feedback and issues. And I've often wanted to ask this question to others.
Yeah, I think, excuse the sort of unwieldy language, but mobile in particular sort of offers us the ability to strap a sensor to a beneficiary in the sense that we're able to interact with them more at scale. A friend of mine who started a company in development that was recently bought, he once said to me, every development program in the future will have both a plan for what they do in the real world and a plan for what they do in the digital world. And I think he's right. I think that there's a whole bunch of different tools. For me, it's not really about advocating any one in particular, but I think the key is if we're going to use digital to engage beneficiaries in mass, we're going to have to do it in a way where we can control the structure of the data first, because I think this is the reason why we try not to run surveys with open text entry, because it's not going to facilitate analysis, at least not automatic analysis or automated analysis. And of course, we're going to have to get the right safeguards in place to take care of that beneficiary's data, because right now, I think the idea is catching on in America that our data is actually worth a lot of money, and that some things that can be done with it that maybe we weren't that keen on. I actually think that problem is probably worse in the developing world. Like, talk about getting your identity stolen because you got on a Wi-Fi network in a cafe. The developing world is even more risk from that. So I think that what we're going to see is reports start to get replaced with real-time data, a lot of which the source is going to be beneficiaries. We are going to get to the place where we're going to be able to automate the analysis of that data so that we can surface an insight faster, but we're going to be playing too much cleanup if we don't do it in the right way. Going once, going twice. I think everybody wants a little bit more coffee, and I know I'm up against a coffee break. So thanks. Oh, I'll let Ted do the honors. He's the MC. By the way, Ted is the color commentator for the University of Houston's football team, and so he is the most qualified person for the job in the room right now.
Thank you, Chris. I greatly appreciate that. A round of applause for Chris. What a fantastic presentation. Great job, Chris. Okay, folks, so we do have a time slot for a little food and beverage break. So why don't we go ahead and take it? We're a little bit early, so we're going to give you guys about 15, 20 minutes, and then we're going to reconvene. Okay? Very good.